I remember driving to the scene for the first time, and I was completely bewildered by where I was going. I was just struck by how remote the area was.
In 1998, 3 days after Christmas, the body of a man was discovered on an isolated beach. It appeared he had been shot execution style.
Everything was a complete mystery. Nothing was known. Who was this man? How did he come to be there? How long had he been there? Where was he killed? We had no answers to any of those questions.
Fingerprinting revealed the man was 25-year-old David John Robinson. His parents hadn't seen him in 8 years.
We always wanted reconciliation. We never stopped hoping, ever.
To lose a loved one in a violent way is life-changing and devastating. As a detective, you're really just working your heart out to make sure that you get the result.
David Robinson was antisocial. He was a loner. He liked isolation. And for those reasons, we struggled to get a good, clear picture of David.
2 decades on, police believe it's never too late to solve a cold case, but it's imperative to consider things differently.
There has been a lot of talk over the years. Someone out there knows what has happened to David.
We've brought together a specialist team to review some of New Zealand's most haunting unsolved murders. They'll use their skills, expertise and up-to-date technology to look at evidence with fresh eyes. For those involved in the original investigation, it's a constant torment that the case didn't get solved.
These types of investigations, they take the toll, they weigh on you. You look at what you did, what you should have done better. You scrutinise your investigation, and it stays with you.
20 years later, David's killer still hasn't been held to account.
It's a very callous way to have died. Someone has had to have had quite a cold heart to be able to do something as extreme as that.
What will it take to solve David Robinson's murder? On December 28, 1998, a family four-wheel driving on a remote West Coast beach south of Hokitika came across what they thought was a dead seal. On closer inspection, it was the body of a man.
The first officer on the scene approached the body. The deceased was in a state of decomposition. He had no upper clothing on. He was face down. He had no footwear on, one sock on and one sock off. He had obvious signs of having been out in the sun, having been out in the elements. The officer turned the body over, and it was at that point that he saw that David had a gunshot wound to the forehead.
With the body in an advanced state of decomposition, identifying the man was a huge challenge.
The homicide inquiry's a challenge to all your skills. In the first 36 hours of this investigation, everything was a complete mystery. So we had to start piecing together the vital information. It was quite evident that David had been dead for some time.
Police say the victim probably died from a single bullet wound. He'd been shot in the centre of the forehead.
Only 2 fingers were suitable for fingerprinting, but they proved crucial. On December 30th, the man was identified as David Robinson.
A car pulled up and a man hopped out and asked who I was, and then asked me if I had a son called David John Robinson and could I give his birth date. And then he couldn't say it any other way, but I'm sorry to have to tell you this, Mrs. Robinson, but your son has been found dead on a remote beach out of Hokitika. And then proceeded just to tell me that he had been murdered. It was complete disbelief.
Because David had lost contact with his family, the original investigators started to build a profile based on his criminal history.
He was itinerant. He was unemployed. He didn't draw a benefit of any sort. He lived hand to mouth by what he gained from petty crime, thefts. He was capable of walking big distances, up to 30 or 40 kilometres a day. He liked to be left alone to himself. He would set up camp in remote areas and he'd live rough. So he was a difficult man to track for those reasons.
It was devastating for David's parents, who had always hoped their son would return to them.
He wasn't always a loner. He was a typical little boy. He had the most gorgeous little face. He was friendly, he was outgoing with people when he was little. We often took our children to the bush, John shop for food. He loved the bush. But maybe it rubbed off from us.
Because they were only this big and that big. Had to come with us. It was compulsory.
Right from an early age, David had behaviour issues, and that never improved really. David had been stealing from about 7 years old.
If you saw it and nobody was there, they'd lose it. Didn't matter who it was or what it was.
When he was 11, unfortunately, there was a bully at the school, older than Davey, and that made it terribly difficult for the boy.
As a teenager, David became withdrawn and his behaviour only deteriorated.
We tried everything. He didn't like school. He hated authority. He hated having to be accountable to authority. He just hated it.
At 17, David left home. His parents equipped him with camping gear and sent him off with their blessing.
We encouraged him to ring us. I don't care what time. We don't want to ever lose touch. He knew we loved him, and he knew we cared.
But it didn't take long for him to come to police attention. And by his early 20s, David's convictions were starting to stack up.
He was arrested many times for petty crime. He would steal food, money, steal from cars, committing these crimes so he could live day to day.
He might ring us at 8 or 9 or 10 at night. I never knew where from, but he only ever told us what he wanted us to know, which was nothing. He'd become a vagabond in a sense and was just moving around.
David made his way to the South Island, where he was arrested in late 1997 and spent some time in jail in Invercargill.
While in custody, David confessed to dozens of burglaries. He wrote to his parents from jail, but they would never see him again. On December 28, 1998, he was discovered shot near Bald Head.
22 round which killed him into his forehead in a very central position and flew quite horizontally to the back of his skull, killing him. That has all the hallmarks of being an aimed shot.
David's body was removed within hours, and the full scene examination could begin.
In 1998, I was working as a detective sergeant. On the 31st of December, I was asked to come over and coordinate the crime scene examination. I travelled down to Ross. I remember driving to the scene for the first time. We went through gates and across creeks and then through a lagoon, and then all of a sudden we're out on the Bald Head part of the beach. It was a challenging area of terrain. The area was sieved for shell casings and any other evidence. We gathered insects to look at their development stage in order to try and establish how long David had likely been in that area. We believe that he could have been literally dumped there by the surf.
The initial pathology report suggested David had been on the beach for around 2 weeks, so police tried to piece together his last movements.
West Coast Police have begun a door-to-door canvass of the Ross Township in their inquiry into the murder of transient David Robinson.
We appealed for sightings through radio, TV. We did pamphlet drops. The challenge for us was to get the public to understand that whilst this is the way David chose to live through petty crime, that he was a real person, that he deserved better, that his death was brutal, and that we all have a responsibility when someone in the community is killed like that to try as a community to deal with it.
Dozens of people came forward with possible sightings. It appeared David had been in the Ross and Hokitika areas in the weeks leading up to his death. Officers started to look for evidence of any of his camps.
Overall, I think there was about 15 campsites that were examined. Any wrappers that were left, we would forward for analysis to see if we could link them. We looked at the theories of whether he had been burgling batches, that he was looking to rip off cannabis grows.
Cannabis growing was rife on the remote west coast, and growers were known to protect their plots at any cost.
There were a number of people who became suspects because they had the profile of someone capable of this level of violence. Some of those suspects, they're also known to be commercial cannabis growers.
But aside from a possible motive, police had no real evidence to link any of the suspects to David's brutal killing.
Suspicion is a useful tool, but it only gets you so far. In terms of proving a murder to the highest standards, I knew we were well short. For me, it was very frustrating that we weren't able to answer a lot of the questions, that we weren't able to narrow down a scene, that we weren't able to better develop suspect information. And it feels like failure.
Who could have murdered David Robinson? Where was he killed? And what was the motive? Can a new investigation answer these questions? And will someone be brought to justice for David's murder? In 1998, David Robinson was found dead on a remote South Island beach, killed by a single gunshot, execution style. No one has been held to account for his murder.
The police in an investigation like this are reliant on people who know what's happened. We need to encourage them to see it through the eyes of the victim and the parents and people who have suffered for 20 years.
We've brought together a group of cold case specialist detectives to spearhead a new inquiry. Leading our review will be Detective Senior Sergeant Jackie Corner, the new officer in charge of the case.
I think it's really important when you start to relook at an investigation that occurred 20 years ago to make sure that you go in there with no preconceived ideas. You want to be able to have a fresh pair of eyes. I'm really hoping to be able to get some answers for David's parents.
Detective Sergeant Chris Power will provide insight into the original investigation.
We had to make assumptions based on the best information at hand. The problem with assumptions is they can sometimes lead you down the wrong path. 20 years later, it's a useful process for the evidence to be looked at afresh.
Detective Sergeant Brent Lyford is the 2IC on this case. He's been reviewing the file and is determined to get a result.
I think there's a huge amount of questions that still need to be answered. The remoteness of where David was found is hugely problematic. The fact that we've got such a big timeline has also been hugely problematic. Do I think it's solvable? Yes. I definitely think it's solvable.
3 detectives, 1 cold case. It's time for the David Robinson investigation to begin. Will a new perspective be the key to solving this homicide?
So let's start at the beginning. When was the last confirmed sighting of David?
Well, what we do know is that David was arrested on the 4th of November 1998 in Haast. He was transferred to the Greymouth Central Police Station cells where he remained in custody for about a week. He struck up conversations with prisoners. He said that once he got bail, then he was going to head south to Haast. and he was going to be down there harvesting some cannabis. The witnesses that were in the cells actually thought that some of what he was saying was bravado and that it was just him talking himself up. When David was bailed, he had a number of items with him, including a dry-as-a-bone oilskin overcoat, a backpack, a blue sleeping bag, a blue ground sheet. He was carrying a red Swiss Army knife and white enamel cup. These items have never been recovered, which I think is quite crucial. From there, well, we think that David has managed to go south, as there's been a number of potential sightings, but certainly nothing that we can hang our hat on and say that that's definitely David. He's quite pale, very, very tall. I haven't seen a lot of 6'4", 6'5" coasters. And of course then he's got big, thick set of hair. So I think David would have, for want of a better term, stuck out like a sore thumb.
At the time, police received dozens of sightings, from Greymouth to as far south as Bruce Bay. The cold case team now focus on the most probable.
What are the sightings that we are more confident of actually being David?
There was a visit to the activity centre in Hokitika mid to late November. A male who fits David's description spoke to a woman there and gave his name as David. Heading south out of Ross, Donohue's Road takes you down quite close to the beach area. One of the locals was walking through there early December and he saw a male fitting David's description but lying face down, and he watched the figure for a while and then moved on and warned other residents to beware of this male in the bushes. There was a sighting outside the Roddy Nugget in Ross where, again, someone fitting David's description in early December was seen scavenging for cigarette butts. So we had that mooching type of behaviour along with a description that fitted David, suggesting quite strongly that would have been him.
What's the last sighting that we have?
We've got several. We've got a couple that the timeline is a little bit loose. We've got between the 14th, potentially the 18th of December, which is a sighting near the Hokitika River, or near the bridge. It was of a male fitting the general description. There was a sighting either the 8th, 11th or the 15th of December. A male wearing a long jacket resembling David's description had gone into the Bushman Centre and had purchased a pie. I'm fairly satisfied as probably Robinson. But in all of the sightings, we've got no 100% hand on heart that it's David Robinson.
These likely sightings put David in a 40-kilometre radius of Bold Head, where he was found shot dead on the 28th of December.
The pathologist believed David had been there for 10 to 14 days.
And so what was it that we know about the weapon?
The bullet fragment located in David's skull was consistent with a .22 calibre projectile. There was what we call lands and grooves on that bullet, which would indicate that it has come from a rifle.
There was no sign of the weapon at the scene, and although unlikely, the team must consider suicide.
We do know that the angle of the trajectory of that shot is unusual with suicide.
There's no anecdotal evidence of him having any suicidal thoughts.
We know that David was a loner and that he was very transient. He enjoyed his own company. The suicide theory just doesn't fit with me.
Davey would never have done that to himself. I just don't believe it was in him to do that, ever. And we knew our son. We knew him.
And on review of the pathology report, the detectives zero in on information that makes suicide even less likely and has never been revealed publicly until now.
We also have a large skull fracture that radiates from his left temple round to the back of his head.
For him to have caused both of those injuries to himself, he'd have to be positioned by rocks to have shot himself and then fallen beside rocks. There was nothing within the scene at the Bold Head that could have caused that skull fracture. It's such a significant injury, you'd have to think that it'd be incapacitating. That's what's sort of led me to think that the two injuries are connected.
Do we know that they go hand in hand?
No, we don't. The pathologist in his report said due to the level of decomposition around the head area, that could not be dated. So we don't know whether it's happened before he was shot or whether it was after. It begs the question, was David seriously assaulted prior to his death? So the skull fracture is hugely important.
With the head trauma unexplained, the detectives look for any possible clues to explain the serious injury.
Following my review of the file, there was another sighting that I believe wasn't reviewed as well as it could have been. There was information that suggests that David was at a function in the area of Nelson Key and Greymouth. Around the time that David went missing, it has been said that David was given a severe beating that actually caused his death. Two males have been mentioned as attending a chef's course there at the time, and we have confirmed that there was a chef's course in the area at the time. There was no mention of David being shot, but it could explain the fractured skull.
Well, it certainly adds a different dynamic to what we have previously thought.
It's a bit of left field news to me, and it needs to be looked at. It needs to be resolved. If anyone was at that party or can recall David Robinson being at that party, or what led to the fight, or any details around that whatsoever, we would appreciate hearing from them.
Whatever happened at this party could be a vital piece of the puzzle in the cold-blooded murder of David Robinson. Cold case detectives are investigating the 1998 death of David Robinson. He was killed by a single gunshot to the forehead.
This is about where David was found, lying on the beach by the witness and the first officer arriving. How did he come to be here? He's between two rivers, but he's above the high tide mark.
What do we think about David actually being murdered right there and then?
You could go back to look at what the motive would be to kill him on the beach at that location, and I can't see a motive. Can't have stumbled onto anyone's cannabis plot in that area because there weren't any. He wasn't close to any batches or any vehicles that he could have broken into. It's hard to know how he could have caused the sort of offence to be shot dead. Despite its remoteness, it's close to properties. It's in an open area. It's difficult to access. I can't see how that would be the preferred location to take him and give him an execution-style death.
Was David shot somewhere else and then transported or brought and just left at Bold Head?
You'd need at least a four-wheel drive to get there, potentially a tractor. If you were to take David to where he was found on foot, you would certainly have to have an accomplice.
Transporting a dead body into an open area and dumping it. It's high-risk behaviour for someone trying to avoid detection. It just doesn't make sense to me.
I think the obvious way that he has got there is being at sea for some period of time and washed up on the beach.
Boots believed to be David's were found nearby, one by the cliffs at Bold Head and the second 6 kilometres north on the beach near Ross.
We made an initial assumption that David had been in the surf and that the boots came off, and that would account for the separation.
What was the understanding of what the flow of the sea or water was going?
The briefing that we were given was that there was a northerly current operating in the area, so the flow was from south to north. The area where David was found was between two river mouths, the Waitaha and the Mikanui. Given the northerly drift, it certainly would fit that if he was put into the sea, it could have happened at the mouth of the Waitaha, or he could have been further up the Waitaha, being picked up by the sea and then carried north to his position.
But could an early assumption about the northerly drift have misled the original inquiry?
There was a couple of locals that talked about losing cattle in some of the rivers that run out to sea, and their observation was that cattle typically travelled south. as opposed to the north flow.
So in a southerly direction.
Southerly direction.
So contrary to the normal flow.
That's right.
Believing the current was northerly, police thought David's body had to have come from south of where he was found. Police now question that assumption and call in David Stapleton, who has an intimate knowledge of currents and tides in the area.
There's a warm current that flows up northwards along the west coast. I think people think that is the only current that happens, but it can get overcome by the wind acting on the sea. From memory, it's sort of about 75% from south to north and about 25% north to south. But if we look in December 1998, it's actually predominantly flowing to the south.
It surprises me to learn this. That puts quite a different consideration on where and how David got to where he was found. If he went in by river into the sea, or was he in the vicinity of the Totara River, which is north of the Waitaha?
David's body was found high on the beach. Can the team's expert identify what tides could have carried him in? Will this give the team a more precise timeline?
During December, we had spring tides around about the 4th, 5th and 6th, and then it went into a period of lower tides, and it was coming back into springs around about the 18th, 19th. Just having a look at the swell heights, they were quite high around about the 6th through to the 16th, and there was some about 2.5 metres around about the 20th.
Would that cause David's body to be shifted on the beach if he's getting caught in this?
It potentially could lift it higher. The sea would be going up higher than the mean high water spring because of that energy.
We believe he's been in that position for 14 days or less.
10 days from the day he was found takes us back to the 18th. That starts to align with your spring tide, doesn't it, David?
Yes, there is a spring tide building up on the 18th, 3.3, and it gets up to 3.4 through to the 20th.
Data also shows there was particularly high rainfall on the 18th of December, which meant rivers would have peaked around that time, leading to a faster flow.
Interestingly enough, witness puts a gunshot on the 18th in the area of the Kakapotahi River.
We haven't resolved who fired a firearm at that time.
That's correct, which is something that we're going to need to go back to.
The tides and weather begin to suggest a tighter time frame for David's murder, and the unexplained gunshot falls right within it. What else can the cold case detectives glean? The pathology report said there was little evidence of sea lice, which meant David couldn't have been in the water for an extended period of time. The team now call on Jane Bretherton to analyse the significance of the findings.
Sea lice are really prevalent around here, and there's actually a colony of seals off the headlands near Bald Head. Sea lice are found in areas where there are seals. They're quite ferocious eaters. They will consume 100-kilo fish within hours.
So does that suggest to us that if he was introduced through a waterway, it had to have been quite close to Bald Head?
Well, the longer that he's in the water would obviously increase, in my opinion, the chance of sea lice finding him and attacking him. So it would indicate to me that he would spend limited time in there.
Whether David came from north or south of the scene, the team now believe he can't have hit the water far from Bald Head.
I feel that we're able to tighten or condense where we're looking at.
I agree. For me, it gives rise to the fact that he's entered the water in a generally small piece of area. If he had have gone in further north or further to the south, I think it's fair to say we would have seen more evidence of sea lice.
20 years on, with the team closing in on the area of David's homicide, will they now be able to narrow down the date of his murder? And will it bring them any closer to David's killer? Our cold case experts are reviewing the unsolved murder of 25-year-old David Robinson, who was found dead near Bald Head, late December 1998. Almost 2 weeks later, David was buried in the family plot in Thames.
A very hard day and a very painful day because it was a day of closure in a sense for John and I, because we were never ever reconciliated with our son the way that we had always wanted to be, and that that was finalised. Yes. So,
I'm usually very stoic.
We know how draining this is on a family, and that they've lost a family member in a violent way. It's a lifetime struggle for them.
when he was lowered into the grave, that was it. All the hopes and dreams that we had for him had gone with him.
Now that the team have been able to identify a tighter area of interest in David's murder, they want to hone in on the timing. They turn to the entomologist who originally worked on the case.
Entomology can be used for determine the time of death because insects have a fixed life history, and if you work back with the environmental conditions where the insect has been growing, you can then work back to when it then arrived at that place.
All but one of the larvae collected from David's body came from the Xenocalliphora blowfly, which was considered extremely unusual because in the past, that particular fly wasn't known to lay on human corpses.
The blowfly itself hasn't been found on human bodies before. It's a New Zealand native. Xenocalliphora usually breeds in decaying seaweed. David's body must have been conditioned to be able to allow it.
The body had to have been on the beach long enough to not smell like human flesh to the blowfly anymore.
For the Xenocalliphora to be interested in the body, it would have to reach a stage of decomposition well into the bloat stage, and could even be the start of the wet decomposition, because they'll be feeding on the bacteria rather than on the flesh itself. I allowed 4 or 5 days for the body to be conditioned, and that meant 10 to 14 days for David's body to be there, based on the maggots' rate of development.
All other specimens analysed by Dr. Crosby reinforce this timeline.
I can't see how David's body arrived at that beach earlier. It just doesn't fit with the entomology.
Is it possible David was killed somewhere else days earlier and dumped within the area the team has identified?
It's hard to say from the insect evidence, but if he had been several days elsewhere, you would expect to find different maggots at higher rate of development. That we did not see.
Would that suggest to you that David's body was not brought from somewhere else and left?
Correct. If there was around in the human settlement area, you would expect them to come to David's body and lay around the mouth region and the wound. Blowflies are really the vultures of the insect world. You would have to have been protected to prevent them laying eggs on him. And that's quite difficult to do, to protect a body.
Dr. Crosby's analysis suggests that David's body likely arrived on the beach between December 14 and 19, which means the cold case team can now compress their timeline.
Coupled with David Stapleton's evidence, the pathologist evidence, and when we all put it all together, those dates stand out to me. 3 independent experts potentially saying the same thing.
But who killed him remains to be answered.
Are we still happy that the cannabis motive and the burglaries or the dishonesty stealing are the 2 likely motives here?
You know, you have to come back to what you know about David and his habits. He survives by petty crime and burgling. It had to be a very real possibility down there that he stumbled into a cannabis grow, which, as we know, are often protected by growers who will use weapons. You know, if it's someone defending their castle, that could be sufficient motive to kill him. It's possible that if he has been caught offending, things have escalated. Outside of that, you start to struggle to have a motive to kill someone in such a brutal way.
In 1998, a number of people were looked into as possible suspects, but one in particular got the attention of police.
He had the background of someone who was violent, had a background as a cannabis grower, and would defend his interest. We considered that he would have the means and the motive. There were a number of concerns around him in terms of his association back to organised crime groups. He dropped into the local police station in Ross, asking about the progress of the investigation. It adds to the suspicion in some ways. So we searched his batch under warrant. There was still nothing at the end of the day to connect David to that batch or that site. He was interviewed and he provided an alibi to an extent.
But he was never the only possible suspect. And in early 1999, helicopter searches were carried out to identify any cannabis plots close to where David was found.
We located several cannabis growing areas, but we weren't able to determine who the growers were. That's where we've got some more gaps in of information in the inquiry. Do we really know who was growing cannabis for sure in that area in 1998 when David was killed?
Police have always had difficulty separating fact from fiction in terms of cannabis growing operations and their link to David's murder. However, recently, new information has come into the inquiry.
In 2016, police received some Crime Stoppers information in relation to a known southwestland cannabis grower being responsible for David's murder.
This particular person did grow cannabis high up in the Southern Alps, 40 to 50 kilometres from the coastline. That person has subsequently been spoken to by police and has refused to cooperate. I would find it unlikely that David would be 50 kilometres inland, but again, if there are any witnesses that could point us in the right direction, then we certainly need to hear from those people.
And for the first time, police can exclusively reveal a vital new lead that could bring them closer to David's killer. Some years after the original investigation, a letter was sent to the police commissioner with details about David's murder.
That letter has named a person of interest, a location of interest, and we're also lucky to have a vehicle of interest in there. That letter is vitally important and it's crucial to the investigation. So what do we think about the person that has actually been named in that letter?
It's my understanding that they certainly have the capability of causing that sort of injury. He was a West Coast local. There is loose information that this person was involved in the cannabis scene and potentially had gang affiliations.
Active inquiries are ongoing into the man named in the letter. And importantly for the investigation, the nominated location matches the area identified by the cold case experts.
I think with the potential of David's body travelling south, that opens up some new avenues of inquiry. We certainly need to speak to the author of that letter so that we can establish the veracity of that information and take that information further. Nobody's saying that the author of that letter is the murderer. That's certainly not the case. What we're suggesting is that that person has got some valuable information. They've named a suspect in that letter.
The team believe the as-yet unidentified letter writer has knowledge that could help bring David's murderer to justice. So locating the author is critical. Will new technology provide the means? The unsolved murder of David Robinson has meant 20 years of unanswered questions for his grieving family.
It saddens me that he continued breaking in and stealing, upsetting other people. However, I don't think he deserved to be shot in the head for that at all. I hate to think that he may have suffered. I hope he didn't suffer. It never stops affecting us, ever.
Yeah. You can't forget.
No.
Police are determined to find David's killer. They've revealed for the first time that they have a letter naming a new person of interest in the investigation.
The letter itself's useful, but unless the author comes forward, how do you confirm the reliability of that letter?
What's been really exciting is in the last year we have been able to re-examine that letter. There's been new technology that the police have acquired and we have been able to discover some new information from that in lines of forensics. Enhancements have progressed our previous forensic results from that letter. which hopefully will be able to lead us to the possible author of that letter.
Well, that's excellent, and it's really encouraging.
And I'm confident with the nature of that forensic evidence that it's only a matter of time before we do identify that person.
As the hub comes to an end, police now review what they need the public's help with. On December 18th, 1998, a gunshot was heard in the Kakapotahi area.
What I find very intriguing, as all of the experts have indicated, that it's very possible that David was deposited in and around the 18th. I spoke to another witness from that area. They did not hear the gunshot, but had said that herself and several of her neighbours were never ever spoken to during the initial inquiry.
Police believe hunters or visitors to the Kakapotahi area in late 1998 could have witnessed or heard something. The team is desperate for clues. Even the smallest piece of information could be of vital importance.
Was he picked up by anyone driving a car? Does someone actually know where his property has gone? Did anyone else see him in that area who can provide us with that vital sighting?
David's fractured skull and reports of a fight at a party in Greymouth need to be resolved.
The key is to identify the two males that have allegedly had this altercation with David, so that we can firstly either eliminate them or to find out exactly what they know.
Police have never located the firearm used in David's murder. The bullet fragment showed it was from a .22 caliber gun, likely a rifle.
We need to locate that firearm. So if anybody knows of where that firearm is now or where it's been disposed of, we need to hear from those people.
And I mean, most definitely, we want the person who has written that letter. I mean, it's crucial to that person to come forward.
Most definitely.
While the hub is now over, the team now have definite new lines of inquiry.
Quite excited about the investigation moving forward. We've got forensic evidence that is a ticking time bomb.
For David's parents, finding their son's killer will give them the closure they need.
Well, we'd be able to lay it to rest once and for all. Once and for all. And Davey can rest in peace. Davey wasn't an evil, wicked young man. He was our son, and we loved him.
And it's not just David's loved ones who want to crack this cold case.
I think the public are the key for us in solving this investigation. Someone out there knows, and so that's what we need.
This will mean an enormous amount to me if this case gets solved, because it'll be the community solving a problem, a violent act that happened within their community. And I think it's important with something this callous that whoever's been involved, that they answer for it. That's the way it should be.